Sometimes the unthinkable happens, and the voice of our favorite band we all know and love gets shown the door. Today we're looking back at the most jaw-dropping times 70s bands fired their singers, and trust me, some of these still sting. Black Sabbath, Ozzy Osbourne. You hear the name Black Sabbath, and I bet most of us instantly hear Ozzy's voice, belting out Iron Man or Paranoid. That sound was everywhere in the early 70s, on FM radio, blasting out of your friend's car speakers, and rattling the walls at parties where the volume knob never came back down. Ozzy just was Sabbath. Nobody else could snarl and howl like that, and back then it felt like heavy metal had been invented overnight. But Ozzy's wild side didn't just stay on the stage, and by the end of the decade, he was partying harder than he was performing. Even his wild bandmates couldn't keep up, and you know you might need to reel it back in when a wild band of the 70s tells you you're a bit too much. So, in 1979, they did the unthinkable. They fired their own frontman. Remember reading that and thinking, how do you fire Ozzy from Black Sabbath? That's like firing thunder from a storm. But funny enough, it worked out. Sabbath carried on with Ronnie James Dio and sounded brand new, while Ozzy bounced right back with Blizzard of Oz and gave us Crazy Train. So yeah, looking back, it might have been the rare breakup where both sides found a second life. Genesis, Peter Gabriel.
Is life again destroyed life? Do they play elsewhere?
If Black Sabbath gave us the sound of heavy metal, Genesis gave us the theater of progressive rock. And that theater was Peter Gabriel. In the early 70s, you never knew what you'd get when Gabriel walked on stage. One night he'd have a flower blooming out of his head, and the next a fox in a red dress, or some surreal character narrating a 20-minute epic. Concerts felt less like gigs and more like a strange, otherworldly play. Melody Maker once called him a surrealist's answer to Mick Jagger. Fans would flip through the magazines just to see what costume he'd dream up next, and for a while, Genesis was as much a visual experience as a musical one. But inside the band, it wasn't all fun. Gabriel's wild imagination and flair for drama often clashed with the rest of Genesis, who felt the music was taking a back seat to the theatrics.
I will now receive my comfort unjudged.
By the time they toured The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway in 74-75, tensions were sky high. You see, the album was a massive undertaking, and Gabriel dominated the narrative with his elaborate story and characters. Phil Collins later admitted, quote, "We felt like passengers on Peter's trip." Even Gabriel himself later said, quote, "I didn't feel like I could be a normal member of the group anymore." And so, by August 1975, he was gone. Officially, it was to spend more time with family, but fans and critics knew the split was inevitable. Many assumed Genesis wouldn't survive without him. After all, Gabriel was the face, the voice, and a spectacle of the band. Rolling Stone wrote that losing him was, quote, like Yes without Jon Anderson, or The Who without Daltrey. But then came the twist. Phil Collins stepped out from behind the drums and took the mic. At first, Genesis sounded leaner, less theatrical. But the band slowly morphed into one of the biggest rock acts of the late 70s and 80s. They traded the costumes and surreal storylines for radio anthems like Invisible Touch. But still, for die-hard prog fans, Gabriel's Genesis will always be the definitive version. The later hits made them stadium kings, but in those early 70s shows, with Gabriel spinning bizarre tales in outlandish costumes, Genesis wasn't just a band. It was performance art, and when he left, that magic left with him. Yes, Jon Anderson. And those early Yes records just wouldn't have been the same without Jon Anderson's voice floating over the top. Roundabout, I've Seen All Good People, he had that high, airy sound that made the band feel like they were from another universe. Yes was already a trip with their long songs, wild artwork, and cosmic lyrics, but Anderson's singing tied it all together. But harmony in the music didn't mean harmony in the band, and by 1979, fights over money, touring, and the direction they were headed finally boiled over, and Anderson got the boot, right alongside Rick Wakeman. Can you believe that? Firing the guy whose voice was yes? They carried on with other singers, sure, but for me and a lot of fans, the magic just wasn't there anymore. Anderson did make his way back eventually, but that late 70s firing is still one of the strangest moves in prog rock history. Pink Floyd, Syd Barrett. Alright, let's talk about the band that defined the 70s, and the ghost that haunted them. Okay, yeah, you're right. Syd Barrett's official departure was in '68, but his story is so woven into the fabric of the band's 70s success, you can't tell one without the other. Syd wasn't just a singer, he was the band's original visionary. He was the guy who wrote those quirky psychedelic gems like Arnold Lane and See Emily Play. When you heard those songs on the radio back then, it wasn't just music, it was a trip into a strange, whimsical world. But the light that burned so brightly started to flicker. Syd's mind, already fragile, was lost to an acid-fueled haze. Stories from that era sound more like a horror movie than a band practice. Roger Waters famously recalled a gig where Syd just stood on stage staring into space, his guitar hanging from his neck. The band, including his friend David Gilmour, who'd been brought in to cover for him, was forced to make an impossible decision. They simply stopped picking him up for shows. I know, harsh, but hey, what are you gonna do? They went on to become the stadium rock legends of the decade, but they never truly left Syd behind. The brilliance and tragedy of his flameout became the very subject of their art. The album Wish You Were Here is a direct and poignant tribute to him.
I won't touch you, but then I might.
The iconic song of the same name and the track Shine On You Crazy Diamond are gut-wrenching portraits of a lost friend. As Gilmour himself put it, quote, "It's the ultimate what if." The band went from a quirky psychedelic outfit to a global phenomenon, fueled by the melancholy of losing their guiding star. And every time you hear those opening notes, you can't help but think of the brilliant spark who lit the fuse and then burned out way too soon. Kiss, Peter Criss. You can't talk about Kiss without picturing the cat man behind the drums, Peter Criss. For a lot of us, his raspy voice on Beth in 1976 was the first time Kiss showed a softer side, and it ended up being one of their biggest hits. Remember slow dancing to that one at a school dance? A disco ball spinning overhead. Not exactly the fire-breathing, blood-spitting Kiss most people thought of, but that's what made it so special. Peter gave the band some heart behind all that makeup and flash. But by the end of the 70s, things were falling apart, and that's putting it politely. Criss was struggling with drug use, clashing with the others, and his drumming was slipping to the point where session musicians were stepping in on the records. In 1980, after Dynasty and the disco-tinged I Was Made for Lovin' You, the band finally cut ties with him. Kiss carried on with new faces behind the paint, but let's be real, for those who grew up with the original four, once Peter was gone, it never quite felt the same. We just missed that cool cat. Uriah Heep, David Byron. Who remembers easy living blasting out of jukeboxes and car stereos in the early 70s? Uriah Heep might never have reached Zeppelin or Purple levels, but they were right there in the heavy rock conversation, and a huge part of that was David Byron. His voice wasn't just powerful, it was theatrical, almost operatic, soaring over those heavy riffs and swirling Hammond organ lines. He could sound angelic one second and dangerous the next. But as iconic as that voice was, Byron himself was becoming unpredictable. His drinking started creeping into rehearsals, studio sessions, and even the live shows. Guitarist Mick Box later admitted, quote, "It broke our hearts. He was one of the best singers we ever had, but we couldn't carry on like that." and by 1976, the rest of the band made the brutal decision to let him go. Officially, it was musical differences, but fans knew what was really happening. For listeners, losing Byron was a gut punch. That voice was Uriah Heep. Critics at the time said replacing him would be like Deep Purple without Ian Gillan. Technically possible, but spiritually impossible. Uriah Heep did soldier on with new singers like John Lawton and eventually Bernie Shaw, but for many fans, the Byron era will always be the classic one.
I'll be looking for you. La, la, la.
Sadly, his story didn't end well. Byron's solo career never took off the way it should have, and in 1985, he died of alcohol-related complications at just 38 years old. Even now though, put on July Morning or Gypsy and you remember why he mattered. That voice was lightning in a bottle, raw, dramatic, unforgettable. And once it was gone, Uriah Heep was never quite the same again. AC/DC, Dave Evans.
Can I sit next to you, girl? Can I sit next to you?
Now here's a name a lot of folks forget, Dave Evans, the original singer of AC/DC. Yep, before Bon Scott came along and gave them the snarling voice that we all know from High Voltage and Highway to Hell. Evans was the guy up front. He fronted them from the very first single, Can I Sit Next to You Girl, back in 1974. Now, the main problem was Evans never quite clicked with the rest of the group. He wasn't big on the gritty working class image the Young brothers wanted, and the chemistry just wasn't there. And so by late 74, the band gave him the boot and brought in Bon Scott, and the rest of course is history. In hindsight, it was the best move they ever made, but it's still wild to think AC/DC started with a totally different voice. It's like finding out your favorite TV show almost had a different lead actor. It changes the way you see the beginning. Like, what if Michael Scott wasn't Steve Carell, but instead it was Bob Saget? You know what? Hey, I'd still watch That Office. I'd still watch it. Deep Purple, Ian Gillan. Next up, the band that gave us the riff. The riff heard round the world, Deep Purple. Sure, everyone knows the opening to Smoke on the Water, but that song wouldn't be a rock anthem without Ian Gillan's voice. The man didn't just sing, he wailed. He had this impossibly high, raw scream that could tear through the heaviest guitar solos. When you dropped the needle on Machine Head at a party, you knew exactly what you were in for. Loud, furious, no holds bars rock and roll. It was the kind of music that made your parents bang on the ceiling. But in rock and roll, a band of big talents often means even bigger egos, and Deep Purple was no exception. Now the main problem was the constant friction between Gillan and guitarist Ritchie Blackmore. The two were a sonic force, but offstage they were oil and water. The tension was palpable. Gillan first quit in 1973, exhausted by the relentless touring and the fighting. The band kept on going with different lineups, but as a fan, it never was the same. In a move that surprised everyone, Gillan rejoined the band for a reunion album in the mid-80s, but that famous chemistry was long gone. As a legendary rock journalist noted, their relationship was just a powder keg waiting to explode. Gillan was back in the band, yay, but the old rivalries just reignited with a vengeance. After a few tumultuous years, he was unceremoniously fired in 1989. For a lot of fans, it was another whiplash moment from a band famous for them. And to this day, the debate rages on about which lineup was best, but for most of us who grew up with them, the sound of Deep Purple will always be defined by that electrifying, sky-piercing scream of Ian Gillan. Styx, Dennis DeYoung. If you turned on the radio in the late 70s, chances are you heard Dennis DeYoung's voice leading the charts for Styx. Come Sail Away, Lady, Babe. He had that dramatic theatrical sound that made Styx stand out from all the other arena rock bands of the day. Remember hearing The Grand Illusion on vinyl for the first time? It was awesome. DeYoung gave Styx their personality, part rock band, part Broadway musical. Now, here's where the timeline gets tricky. DeYoung didn't actually get pushed out until the 80s, but since Styx was such a big part of the 70s scene, it's worth talking about.
You know it's you, babe, whenever I get weary.
And the seeds of this sad falling out were definitely planted in the 70s, so by the turn of the decade, some of the guys in the band were tired of his ballads and big production style. And the split was nasty. For a lot of fans, it was a heartbreaker. You couldn't imagine Styx without his voice. To me, Styx without Dennis DeYoung is like a jukebox missing half the buttons. Sure, it'll play, but it just won't sound right. Foreigner, Lou Gramm. Man, who didn't have hot-blooded or feels like the first time stuck in their head back in the late 70s? Foreigner was everywhere. And Lou Gramm's voice, forget about it. Smooth when he wanted to be, gritty when the song demanded. He had that rare mix of power and soul that could cut through the noise. Rolling Stone even called him one of the greatest rock singers of the era, and you can hear why in about 5 seconds of Double Vision. Now here's the twist, yes, Lou wasn't actually fired in the 70s. He rode shotgun with Foreigner through their monster run, Cold as Ice, Urgent, Waiting for a Girl Like You. All the way to I Want to Know What Love Is. But by the late 80s and into the 90s, things got pretty messy. Lou wanted the band to lean back into their hard rock roots, while Mick Jones was chasing that polished, radio-friendly sound. Lou once said, quote, "I was feeling like a sideman in my own band." Eventually, the tension snapped, and in the early 90s, Gramm was out. For a lot of fans, this was unthinkable. Lou's voice was Foreigner. Critics flat out said the band without him was like The Doors without Jim Morrison. Foreigner kept on going with some new singers, but let's be real, nobody belts jukebox hero like Lou Gramm. And even though he came back for reunions here and there, that firing just proved something wild. In rock, even the voices you thought were untouchable could be pushed aside. And whenever I hear Double Vision today, I still shake my head at the idea someone looked at Lou Gramm and thought, yeah, we can do without him. I mean, crazy. Rare Earth, Peter Rivera. Do you remember Rare Earth? They had that funky rock sound that made you just move. Songs like Get Ready and I Just Want to Celebrate were everywhere in the early 70s. You couldn't go to a cookout or a bar without hearing one of those jams. And the crazy part, their drummer Pete Rivera was also the lead singer, and that was pretty rare back then. Yeah, pun intended. But as the decade rolled on, things got messy. Rivera butted heads with the band and the management, and by '74, they showed him the door. Can you imagine that? Firing the voice behind all their biggest hits? Sure, Rare Earth kept on going without him, but for a lot of us, that band was Peter Rivera. I still can't hear Celebrate without picturing him pounding the drums and grinning like he was having the time of his life. Journey, Steve Perry. Next up, the band that turned smooth rock into a stadium-sized event. And the reason for their success was Steve Perry. If you were a teenager with a driver's license in the late 70s, you couldn't escape his voice. It was pure gold, effortless, soulful, and with a range that seemed to defy gravity. Tracks like Wheel in the Sky and Lovin', Touchin', Squeezin', they didn't just top the charts, they became the soundtrack to many of our lives. By the time Escape dropped in '81 with Don't Stop Believin', Journey wasn't just a band, they were an institution. His voice was what transformed them from a prog rock jam band into the kings of arena rock.
Wheel in the sky keeps on turning. I don't know.
Now yes, you're right, the official split was a bit later in the mid-'80s, but the story of Journey is so tied to Perry's rise and fall that it feels like part of a 70s rock saga. The band's initial split with Perry came in 1987. After a long tour for their album Raised on Radio, Perry was exhausted and just wanted a break. The rest of the band, however, was eager to get back on the road, and the tension over the touring schedules and Perry's lingering health issues, specifically a degenerative hip condition, it created a divide, and not just in his hips, that couldn't be bridged. Journey did eventually reunite with Perry in the mid-90s for the album Trial by Fire, but after a few years, his hip issues returned, and when he refused to tour without getting a hip replacement. The band issued an ultimatum: get surgery and tour, or they'd replace him. And Steve Perry was out. You can swap out singers all you want, but for me, Journey without Steve Perry just doesn't feel like the real thing. No one else has that unique power to hit you right in the chest with those impossible high notes. REO Speedwagon, Terry Luttrell.
It's been such a whirlwind since I saw you.
Now most folks remember REO Speedwagon for the 80s ballads, Keep On Lovin' You, Can't Fight This Feeling. But back in the early 70s, they were just another scrappy Midwestern rock band trying to figure it out. And before Kevin Cronin came along, the guy up front was Terry Luttrell. He had the pipes, he had the look, and he helped put REO on the map. The thing is, Terry didn't last.
I can't fight this feeling anymore.
By 1972, he and the guitarist Gary Richrath were butting heads left and right. The fights got so bad that Luttrell was pushed out of the group entirely. Of course, it did end up being a blessing in disguise for the band. Cronin took over, and we all know where that led. But you gotta admit, it's wild thinking that the voice on REO's debut got canned before the world even knew what was coming. Jefferson Starship, Marty Balin. Think back to the late 70s, Jefferson Starship was everywhere. Miracles, Count on Me, Runaway. Those songs were glued to radio playlists. And a huge part of that sound was Marty Balin. His voice had this smooth, soulful, almost dreamy quality that gave Starship a softer romantic side. Miracles especially, that track was pure atmosphere. But behind the scenes, it wasn't a great atmosphere. By 1978, Marty was worn down. The endless tours, the tension in the band, and the feeling that his input was being sidelined.
You can count on me, girl.
It all just piled up, and officially he left after Earth. But insiders said it felt more like he was being pushed out, frozen until he couldn't stick around anymore. Marty himself later admitted he was tired of the ego battles in the group. And for a lot of fans, this stung. Critics called him the heart of Jefferson Starship, and without that warm, emotional vocal, the band leaned harder into the slick arena rock territory. They still scored hits in the 80s, but a lot of the old school fans felt like the soul was missing. It's almost worse than a dramatic firing. It was like someone slowly turned down Marty's mic until the crowd forgot he was there. Even today, if you cue up Miracles, you get why his absence left such a hole. That's not just a song. That's Marty Balin wrapping you in a sound nobody else in Starship could touch. Fleetwood Mac, Bob Welch. Before Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks turned Fleetwood Mac into one of the biggest bands on the planet, there was Bob Welch. He's the guy who held the group together in the early 70s, steering them through albums like Mystery to Me and Heroes Are Hard to Find. But by 1974, things behind the scenes weren't so chill. Welch was feeling isolated. The rest of the band was itching for a change.
Your eyes got me dreaming. Your eyes got me blind.
And Mick Fleetwood has admitted Bob was basically nudged out to make way for Buckingham and Nicks. Talk about a tough break. You keep the ship afloat and then get tossed overboard right before it strikes gold. Fleetwood Mac skyrocketed to superstardom, but a lot of fans never forgot the Bob Welch years. He may not have been there for rumors, but without him, the band might not have survived long enough to make it. Blood, Sweat, and Tears, Al Kooper.
Catch a painted pony, let the spinning wheel turn.
Next up, a name you might not know was even part of the story. Al Kooper, the founder of Blood, Sweat and Tears. Now, Kooper was a true musical chameleon. He played organ on Bob Dylan's iconic Like a Rolling Stone and founded the Blues Project. The guy had this raw, soulful, slightly gravelly voice that was perfect fit for his latest idea, a band that mashed up rock, jazz, and horns. And yeah, it worked.
Like a rolling stone.
Their 1968 debut, Child is Father to the Man, was a critical darling. It was sophisticated, it was cool, and it felt like rock music had finally gone to college. But here's where the story takes a bit of a dark turn. After the album was recorded, the rest of the band, particularly the horn players, wanted more control over the creative direction. Kooper, being the visionary, wanted to maintain the artistic control, and the tension was just too much. And in a shocking move, Kooper was pushed out of the band he created in 1968, just before they were about to become superstars.
Something going on, but I don't know what it is.
Kooper's replacement, David Clayton Thomas, came on board and sang lead on their second self-titled album, which went on to sell 4 million copies and win a Grammy. It was a massive hit, launching them into the stratosphere with hits like Spinning Wheel and You've Made Me So Very Happy. By the time most of us were hearing them on the radio, the guy who had the idea was gone. As Kooper himself later joked, quote, "I was the best fired person in the history of rock and roll." It's a harsh reminder that sometimes even the genius who lights the fuse doesn't see the fireworks. The Stooges, Dave Alexander. The Stooges were never a radio band. You didn't hear I Wanna Be Your Dog sandwiched between the Eagles and Fleetwood Mac. With Bob Welch or not. But in the underground, Dave Alexander's bass was the glue holding all that chaos together. He was there when the band basically invented punk before anyone had a name for it. But Dave's exit, pure rock and roll infamy. At the 1970 Goose Lake Festival, he showed up so drunk he literally couldn't play.
Across the USA. It was another year for me.
In mid-set, Iggy Pop just turned around and fired him on the spot, in front of the audience. Imagine getting booted from the band in real time with thousands of fans watching. Yikes, humiliating. Alexander never came back, and though the Stooges kept rolling, that onstage firing went down as one of the most brutal, dramatic exits in 70s rock and roll history. And there you have it. The voices we thought were untouchable, all getting tossed out of their own bands. Some bounced back bigger than ever, like Ozzy riding that crazy train all the way to solo stardom. But others faded into the background, leaving us to wonder what might have been if they'd stayed. Either way, it shows just how wild the 70s music scene really was. One day you're blasting from every radio in town, the next you're out on the curb with your mic stand. So let me ask you, which of these firings shocked you most back then? And did you stick with the band after the switch? Or were you loyal to the singer who left? Now this is important, please drop your stories, your memories in the comments below. Because after all, we here at Do You Remember are nothing without you. We had a ton of fun putting this one together, and I sure hope you enjoyed it. If you did, hit that thumbs up icon for us. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss a trip down memory lane. But most importantly, from my entire team here at Do You Remember, I'm Nostalgic Nick, hanging the mic back up. Well, at least until the next video.